Hello everyone. So you asked me, are pangolins being affected by climate change and deforestation? How will climate change make things more difficult for the pangolins to survive? Now, it's important to realize that in the context of climate change, pretty much everything on the planet is affected. Every species has its own needs in terms of where it sleeps, where it might be roosting, burrowing, etc. And of course, it also needs food. Now, what most animals eat is also going to be dependent on environmental resources. So things that are strongly seasonal are going to be affected by the climate. There's actually some really interesting examples in parts of Australia where the Aborigines would know that the fishing would be available when a certain tree came into flower, except that didn't seem to be a good signal in recent years. What we've seen is what we call climatic asynchrony. That means that two things that used to occur together start occurring at different times. And this might be caused by a whole variety of different things. For example, one of them might rely on the length of the day. The other might rely on the minimum temperature or the rainfall. And so these things that used to rely on each other suddenly don't happen together because they were relying on different types of climate signal. And these climate signals all change in different ways. And this is really important for a lot of species, not just the pangolin, but almost everything. For example, if we think about when birds hatch out, normally they will hatch out when there is the peak amount of insects available for their chicks to eat. But when those eggs were laid depends on one signal. When the insects and that kind of thing come out, may rely on a different type of climate signal. So under climatic change, which is much more complex than just getting hotter, what we see is that those chicks might hatch out before the insects are available, or they might hatch out too late, and so the food isn't available for them. This is even worse for migratory species because they might be trying to arrive just when there's food. And if they get there at the wrong time, there isn't any food. So climate change is important for all species. In the case of the pangolin is threatened by a whole lot of different things. There are actually 8 species of pangolin, 4 of them in Africa, 4 of them in Asia. Now, they come into 3 different what we call genera. All of the ones in Asia, which are basically all critically endangered, are what we call in the Manis group. So they're all close relatives to each other. The main threat to the pangolin isn't just the loss of habitat, though. It's actually hunting, because there are some people who believe that the scales of the pangolin have medicinal properties. And as a consequence, we're actually losing a pangolin to poaching about every 5 minutes on average. They're the most trafficked animal on the planet. So their main threat is for hunting, mainly for scales, but also for their meat. And because the pangolins in Asia have become so rare, they've actually started importing more from Africa. And there have been seizures of thousands of tons in the last few years because it's harder and harder to get them from Asia. Now, of course, climate change and habitat loss are also major issues, but those aren't the most important factor for the pangolin. They're just an additional factor that, as well as being hunted to extermination, they're also finding it hard to find the areas that they need to get enough insects to feed on, because pangolins typically feed on insects. One of the problems with this is also if we confiscate pangolins that someone's been trying to smuggle in, it's very difficult to take care of them in captivity. And one of the big problems for a pangolin is they're not good at breeding in captivity. Often they just die. So whereas for many species, when they're threatened and when they're losing habitat, what we'll do is we'll put them in an enclosure in a zoo or something, we'll try and breed a big enough population so we can protect and restore their habitat and release them. But for an animal like the pangolin, because it has a pretty specialist diet, it's very difficult to do that because they just don't breed or do well in captivity. So climate change is one issue because it limits food availability. Deforestation is one issue because it means basically they're losing their homes. But the main issue for all 8 species of pangolin is the fact that we're just killing too many of them for medicine. And if we want pangolins to have a future, we need to protect not just their habitats, but also educate people that there are better sources of medicine out there, and that we want the next generation to be able to enjoy seeing wild pangolin species. It's also really important to note that pangolins used to be really common in some areas. If you talk to people in rural areas, they'll talk about when they'd see pangolins on the way to school in the morning. You just don't see that anymore, because the hunting pressure has been so severe that they've lost most of their former habitat. And in fact, in somewhere like China, whereas the Chinese pangolin used to be the most common species, now many of the pangolins that are captured are actually the Malaysian pangolin. They may not even be native here. They may have escaped from areas where they've been held in captivity before being used for medicine. So we've seen a whole shift in the entire community of the pangolin. And for some species, like the species in Palawan in the Philippines, that is a more forest-reliant species, and so it's critically endangered because of overhunting, the fact it has a really small habitat, specific climate range, and its habitat is being destroyed. So we need to be better neighbours and make sure the pangolin has a better future.